I hope you can see me all right. Michelle, give me a nod. Is everything looking good on our screen?
Looks good.
Oh, good. Well, welcome to all of you joining us today. My name is Geena Clonan. I'm the founding president of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. For nearly 3 decades, the Hall has worked to discover and share the stories of women. Our various educational platforms acknowledge the individual and the collective feminine voice. There's no more important time than now to talk and listen. This will be a half-hour intimate and informative chat, followed by 15 minutes of your questions, which we encourage you to submit at any time by simply clicking the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. Our goal is simple: a virtual gathering to talk about today's important issues. We hope this will be a useful source of information while offering up helpful takeaways. The title of our 2-part webinar series, airing today and next Thursday, this Historic Pandemic Shesession, is to present the findings of a groundbreaking report recently released called Essential Equity: Women, COVID-19, and Rebuilding Connecticut. This report is a collaboration between funders and member organizations of the Connecticut Collective for Women and Girls and the Connecticut Data Collaborative, and was made possible by generous funding from the Aurora Women and Girls Foundation. The Shesession, it's a tongue twister, is a term used to explain the historic effect of this pandemic's recession on women, which is unlike past recessions that affected predominantly men. This week, we're going to focus on condensing the data from this report and explaining it in an understandable fashion. These findings elucidate inequities both familiar and unfamiliar, but regardless of age, gender, or politics, these findings affect everyone. As Executive Director of the Connecticut Data Collaborative, today's guest works to provide the public with accessible data that informs decision-making. Public policy and politics are her driving forces. A recent quote best describes her mission: "Data are a public asset and should be used to promote the social good." Under her leadership, this nonprofit was assigned the important task of Connecticut's 2020 census, and her as the point person and the Essential Equity Project. Please welcome Michelle Riordan-Nold. Hi there.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice to be here today.
Oh, so happy to have you. This is really, truly a groundbreaking and important report, which for most of us, we're not engaged with data in that way, and we may find it a little bit difficult to digest. So we're happy to have you today to walk us through it, because we all need to know what's going on in the pandemic, in the recession, in Connecticut, across the country, and around the world. And this certainly helps us to look at that. So let's begin with the report's key findings. Tell us if you were to just draw out a couple of things, tell us which of those you would elucidate, and were they expected, and which were surprising to you?
Sure, yeah, I'll do my best to make this digestible. It's a big report with a lot of data in it, but so just to start, to help ground us, about half of the labor force in Connecticut is female. And of the females who are in the labor force, 48% work in industries that are considered essential workers, so childcare, education, retail, and healthcare. So it's not surprising to hear that, or to know that women were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, with so many working in essential industries. This, translated into females experiencing higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of COVID cases because of their exposure risks, and higher rates of anxiety. I think what is surprising is the magnitude of the impact. So we know the workforce of the sectors impacted are predominantly female, as I mentioned, but when you put it all together, it's half, as I said, half of females are impacted. So that what's surprising too is that means that recovery efforts need to be targeted to female workers. Another surprising finding was that when we disaggregated the data by race, when the data were available that way, it revealed disparities, due to systemic racism that exists in our systems of employment, healthcare, childcare. So just to give an example, and I'll show a slide with some data on it, but 43% of continued unemployment claims were by Black and Latino women, yet they make up a smaller share of the workforce. So let me just share my screen with some data on it because I can't resist to share lots of numbers.
Thank you.
And is it just showing the
That looks
slide?
great. Yep.
Yep. Okay, good. So here you can see just, so I mentioned 49% of the labor force, that bottom number are women, females, 40% of the Connecticut labor force are females. 56% of continued unemployment claims were filed by females. So that's not traditional in previous recessions. It's largely been men who have been impacted. So that's why they're called as the Shesession, because again, it's because the sectors that were impacted. So if you think back to the 2008 recession, it was construction, housing, and here we have childcare, education, retail, healthcare, hospitality. So that's why we have larger unemployment numbers. And then 70% of females who identify their race and ethnicity as other, and that's a census data point so they collected as other, which is unfortunate that they have this broad category, but experienced a loss of income since March.
Mm-hmm. So some of these findings clearly are directly related to the pandemic. Are others just an extension of the entrenched realities of inequity, particularly women in the workplace? I mean, look at the unemployment numbers, but sometimes we're told that women have given up looking for jobs or getting back into the workforce because they're dealing with childcare and homeschooling and all the things that have presented themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and I do have, I can talk a little bit about the women dropping out of the workforce, or, and I would maybe not dropping out is the right word, but maybe being forced out, right, because of childcare issues. Also, you have many women working part-time jobs, right, having flexible schedules, working multiple part-time jobs to balance childcare issues, and then also therefore experiencing unemployment, not having the social safety net needed. I mean, as I mentioned, much of the data in this report, when we were able to disaggregate it by race, you will see that there are disparities between Black and Hispanic women compared to white women.
And that was my next question. So let's talk about the data pointing to gender and racial inequality, particularly in healthcare. And you mentioned this right at the top of our minds and our bodies, because you mentioned, I believe, anxiety and how women are facing that during this pandemic.
Yeah. So just overall here, 54% of COVID cases were females. But, in terms of the impact of COVID on Black and Hispanic population, it's what we've heard, right? That Black and Latino women have higher rates of cases, hospitalizations, deaths, and even excess deaths. So for example, Black people make up 10% of the population in Connecticut, but we're 18% of COVID cases and 15% of deaths. So Latino women make up 16% of the Connecticut population, but we're 28% of COVID cases. So you have the disparate impact of the pandemic itself, and that's largely due to the workforce and the industries that were impacted by this pandemic.
And Michelle, isn't it so many? In a time when we're talking a lot about immigration, there are so many workers who can't even apply for unemployment and have been greatly affected, particularly in the hospitality area, even in healthcare areas with men and women working in hospitals and maybe not having the resources or the ability to make claims. Were you able to collect that kind of data, or that's outside of the norm?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, no. We did at the beginning. We wanted to understand the immigrant experience, but it's very difficult to get data that way. And understandably so, right? Even as an immigrant, there's particularly last year a lot of fear in identifying yourself as an immigrant. So if you had a government agency asking you to identify yourself, you would probably not want to apply or
Sure,
let that be known.
You must have had a lot of experience with that in the census.
Yes,
Trying
yeah. I
to,
mean, that was, there was a huge effort to try and get the word out that everyone should be counted and that the data would be protected and secure and not, only withheld by the Census Bureau and not shared with other agencies. But yeah, that was, it was, and then when we looked at response rates, over time last year, you would see in our major cities in Connecticut that response rates were much lower than, say, our suburban towns.
and as we're talking about the adverse effects that this pandemic has had on Black, Latino, and Asian women, are we better off or worse here in Connecticut than the rest of the nation, would you say?
I don't know if we're better or worse off. We didn't compare to the nation in our study, but my feeling is that any disparity means we're worse off, right? We shouldn't be happy until we see zero. So whether it's higher or lower than Connecticut, than the nation or other states, we shouldn't be satisfied, right? So we should just look to zero being our benchmark.
Exactly. Exactly. So let's talk about the workplace, if you would, because I know that's of particular interest to all of us.
Mhm.
Um, Before we talk about where we are in the workplace now, a year into the pandemic, can you give us some hard facts about women's employment in this, the stats about women on the front lines, in the classroom, essential workers, our dominance of service industries, restaurants to retail to small businesses? And I've heard so often of women in corporations having to jump off the fast track trying to break the
Mm,
ceiling because there were other demands being made on them and something had to give.
mhm. Yeah, no, yeah, so leading up to the pandemic, women had made steady progress in the labor market over the last 3 decades, and rates of participation in the workforce had been increasing year over year. So nationally, women's participation was at actually an all-time high. In Connecticut, 78% of females were in the labor force prior to the pandemic, and a third of those women in the labor force had children under 18 years of age. And in terms of the gender wage gap, that was also decreasing, but economists predict that will change too because of the pandemic. Now, in terms of thinking about women who have, and as we've heard, been forced out of the labor force because of childcare demands, um, we don't have statewide data on that, but at the national level, in January, it was 2.5 million females have been driven from their jobs. So the last time the rate of participation by females was this low was in April 1987, so about 35 years ago.
Mhm.
So, and then if you look at women with children, so women with children 2 to 6 years of age, their participation in the workforce decreased by almost 6% compared to 1% for men. And it's not that women are unemployed either. It means they were forced out, most likely due, as I said, due to childcare burden of the pandemic. What we tried to do in the report is we tried to estimate. So if Connecticut, and we will get the numbers, they just aren't out yet at the state level. If Connecticut experiences the same kind of drop in women's participation, so we estimated, we looked at what if it's a 1% or 3% drop in the labor force, it could mean between 146 to $500 million in lost wages.
Wow.
Yeah. And that doesn't account for the ripple effect of, income tax decreases, the ripple effect on our economy. So decreases in sales tax too, because when you're earning less as a household, you're going to consume less as well. So
So the she session, it's just a broader way to look at it. It isn't just about individuals. It's about communities, towns, the entire state.
mhm,
So as I said at the beginning, regardless of where we are in this affects every one of us.
mhm, it does.
So I know there's a lot of talk of late about the second shift, which is homework like never before. It comes as no surprise, and you've mentioned it over and over again, that the bulk of duties and responsibilities related to family and childcare, as well as domestic tasks, fall on women. We know that men are participating more and more and at higher levels, particularly in younger generations. But explain exactly, if you can look at the trajectory of the last year,
Mhm.
how did you see that happening? Was it, and as you collected this data, was it a slowly moving target? Did it come in big chunks? Was it better over summer? Did it worsen in winter? I mean,
Mhm.
and what does it look like now when we start to see things opening up?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we did see our, largest drops in labor participation in September. So, that was of women, tied to reopening of schools, which, for many people, it meant kids were home, e-learning. Um, so, what we know prior to the pandemic is some data shows us that in households where both parents work, the average mom did almost 60% of the childcare. That's about 3 more hours per week than of childcare. If there's a child less than 5 years old, mom spends 6 more hours on childcare. And there was a survey that was done every 2 weeks by the Census Bureau, and it reported that 76% of parents who needed to stay home instead of work were females, compared to only 24% of men. So, just to give you perspective on, the burden, right? Or not burden, children aren't a burden, but just the demands on women, and then the choices that are made, right? And um, the fact that women often do bear that responsibility. So then you can see from the data, and I'll show you some slides, just the repercussions in terms of looking at, see if I can shift, mental health concerns for women during the pandemic, and still, ongoing, but 70% of females reported experiencing mental health concerns. And then you particularly, was particularly acute when you looked at the data for Black and Hispanic women, but 75% of Hispanic females reported mental health concerns. We looked also at, just skip to the next slide. We looked at the eviction crisis, which is, imminent once they lift the moratorium. But 19% of women, but 32% of Black women have no confidence in the ability to pay rent. And it's estimated between 66,000 and 133,000 households in Connecticut are at risk for eviction. So that's pretty serious in terms of also thinking about, it's not just an individual in that household. There's
Yeah.
children often in the household. And so how many people does that 66,000 and 133,000 represent?
A lot more.
Right.
What are some of the other okay, here we go. This is
Yeah, and then
domestic
just,
violence.
the safety concerns, right? As we were all isolated in our homes, people feared, for women experiencing domestic violence, and, that has borne out in the data as well, where you have a 30% increase in calls to Safe Connect domestic violence hotline. What's really interesting too, and it's not on this slide, but there was a 125% increase in time spent on calls by domestic violence advocates, because of the complex nature of issues during COVID-19. So, many of the shelters had to reduce their capacities in order to maintain social safe distancing. And that resulted then in women and families being moved to hotels. So, and that's where you see a 43% increase in costs due to domestic violence survivors having to be moved to hotels so that they could be safely
And
kept.
I do recall Michelle in one of our webinars last year talking about domestic violence. It was reported that particularly um, child abuse was going undetected because they weren't in
Mm,
schools or they weren't in public places where
mhm,
there would be other awareness factors, and that was they couldn't even grab some of the data on that because it
mhm.
was hidden from sight.
Right, right. Yeah, your mandatory children weren't seeing, typically who the mandatory reporters are, which are, pediatricians, right? Many visits didn't happen or happened virtually if possible. And then, right, like you mentioned, schools or after school programs or daycare, right? All of that was, yeah, so our typical mandated reporters. I don't think we have the numbers yet on the impact of that, except that there was a drop,
Mhm.
right, in numbers being reported. But I think this year, we'll see how it plays out, unfortunately.
And do you continue to gather data around this report? Is this an ongoing? I know that this covered a certain period, right? September to December?
Right, March through to September.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where is the report leading now, or what are the addendums, or how is it?
Yeah, I mean, we are hoping, we've talked to Aurora Foundation. They're very interested in maybe taking a look at the recovery efforts and where and how women have fared, in the recovery. So um, definitely interested in that. We haven't yet set what time period we're going to look at and when we'll start that, but stay tuned.
Okay. Tell me, so do you have any more screens to share with us? Because I think,
I don't. I can stop. Would you like me?
no, I just wondered if there was, so what are the major areas that were looked at? I wondered if you could just
Okay.
repeat. Oh, hunger, we
Oh,
didn't.
I did. Yeah, we did also talk about hunger. Yeah. Um, and again, calls to 211 for buying food increased by 4 times. The SNAP applications too, 300% increase in SNAP applications. And the first number, 1 in 5 Hispanic females, that's coming from the Census Bureau survey that they ran biweekly. But so the major, and this is the report, which you can find on womenandgirls.ctdata.org. But I think, Sarah, I interrupted you, but you were going to ask about the major parts of the report?
Yeah, I mean, we see the screen flashing in front of us, but when
Okay.
you set out to do this, did you have, what were the major areas that you wanted to collect from?
Yeah, so we wanted to look at obviously COVID, how that impacted women, and then the economy. So we were interested in that, childcare because of the issues of childcare and women, and all the intermingling of all these issues together. We also, safety was a concern. So under safety, we put, domestic violence, looking at child abuse and neglect. And then housing, that was, also a major concern that was raised by many people. And then in addition, I'm missing mental health, right?
Uh,
So that is another section of the report, which goes into more depth than what I have talked about here. But so, sometimes we were limited by the data, right? It's hard to get real-time data. Fortunately, during the pandemic, the Census Bureau stepped up with their survey. The Department of Labor is putting out weekly files, on unemployment claims, continued unemployment claims, and they really did, provided data even, by gender, which is unusual, but then by education level, by race. So they did quite a bit of work at the Department of Labor to, keep people updated on what's going on, and still still are, I should say.
So
But
as your
yeah.
job leading a project like this, tell us, were there phone calls? Were there surveys? Were there people knocking on doors? I mean, I don't know anyone who's ever done what you're doing. So let us know how, I mean, and it's obviously a project of this scope. You had to make choices and you had to be constantly on top of it. Tell us from your point of view, uh, what this entailed.
Sure. So our focus was to look at public data that was, readily available. So we didn't survey because that takes a long time. We wanted to get this out in a timely manner before the legislative session so that it would give legislators an idea of, the impact on women so that they could, legislate, and direct policy to recovery. So, our sources are state agency data, or like I mentioned, the federal government Census Bureau data that's available at state level. And, I have a team, a great team who helped put this together too.
Right.
So lucky to have good staff who, good smart staff who could help pull it all together, analyze the data, and find, what were the findings.
So let me just see. I want to make sure that we've covered what we could this week, because next week we're going to talk about how this can be used in a way to implement change here in Connecticut. I know that last year when we had the good fortune to speak with Miguel Cardona and we were talking about
Mm.
schools and getting back to schools, I would imagine the Department of Education, a report like this was so helpful to them and I mean, this is really an interdisciplinary
Mhm.
action that helps agencies around the state to move forward with their plans. And of course, the reopening of schools has always been crucial, and we're in it now. I imagine this report played a major role in that, considering that women were teaching from home, working from home,
Mhm.
taking care of children. And in order for them to even get back to any normalcy, school had to be one of the things to be addressed. Would you agree
Mhm.
with that? And do you have anything more to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Getting kids back in school, right? Because school serves as childcare for many families, and we're not going to see participation rates go back up unless, children, workforce participation rates go back up unless children are, back in school. So yeah, I think, it's critical come this fall to get everybody back in school.
So tell us about what kind of, after this report, you collected everything and you put it out there. What kind of feedback did you get? Who were the people who said, wow, yay, nay? I mean, were they just state agencies? Did you get feedback from elsewhere, maybe even outside of Connecticut? Tell us what the experience has been like.
Sure, yeah. Well, very positive. We did hold, we released the report back in January, and we had a presentation, and I believe we had about 150 people attend that the release of the report. So that was quite good, quite a good showing, particularly, a virtual showing, right?
Sure.
Um, but the feedback has been positive. I mean, many advocates are using the data that's presented in their advocacy efforts. I know Representative Kate Farrar from West Hartford has used the data in her work at the legislature. So, so we have, it's been positive. I think, we do in Connecticut have a lack of, I'd say, um, places and organizations that are, aggregating the data and telling the story for Connecticut, particularly, cutting across sectors and looking at, the broad scope of what's happening. So we, by putting this out, it was, the first time people were seeing the data all in one place, right? We had all heard, we're hearing that, COVID was impacting Black and Hispanic women more than white women. We were hearing, unemployment was impacting women more than men, and continued claims. But to actually see the numbers and to see, how much of a disparity was going on, enabled and hope and drove some people to action, right, to make changes.
And do you think this is something that the state legislature is looking at to be able to, assign funds and to see where monies need to go to shore up things as we begin this recovery process?
I hope so.
And I'm
And
sure next week with
I was just
I
going to
know
say, I
that
think. Yeah, your guest next week should have a better pulse. She will have a better pulse than me on where and what has been done.
Yeah, getting it out there, getting it in front of the right eyes, and actually then promoting action, I think is what we're going to hear next week from the executive director of the Aurora Foundation, because we'll be talking about what to do with all this data,
Mm.
how to get it where it needs to be, and how to get it to affect change, which of course is Michelle's focus always, that this would bring about effective public policy. And that's
Mhm.
what we're looking at in as we still are in the pandemic and continue to be in the pandemic. These issues are not going away anytime too soon. I hope you'll start to put in your questions. Where
Mm.
it's coming upon 1 o'clock, and we'd like you to talk with Michelle and let us know what you've been thinking of. And we'll keep in mind that today is Happy Earth Day to
That's
everyone.
right.
Thank you, Liz, for mentioning that. We care about mothers as we care about Mother Earth, Gaia.
Mhm.
So here's a question for you. Could Michelle say more about other data resources on women and girls, especially something called the Women and Girls Data Platform?
Sure. So if you go to womenandgirls.ctdata.org, that will bring you to the Women and Girls Data Platform. So that we was funded by Aurora Foundation, Fairfield County Community Foundation, and as well the Women's Collective. So what we tried to do, and that we did that in 2019, we launched the Women and Girls Data Platform. But the idea is to provide accessible public data on women. So where we can get disaggregated data by gender and race and ethnicity, if possible, we provide that on the platform. So we have data on housing, employment, demographic data, health data, education data. So I do encourage you to go there to the womenandgirls.ctdata.org and explore. We also break it down by different geographies. So there is statewide data, but then there's also county level data, and some large towns are included as well. So
That's an incredible resource, for public and private institutions. As nonprofits, we're constantly in need of that
mhm.
relative to the decisions that we make. I mean, just in the hall, we make decisions about educational platforms and how we can affect change across Connecticut with those programs for women and girls. So that's a wonderful piece of
Mhm.
information. Just a heads up to you, Michelle. Again, someone said thank you for this information. The report is an excellent resource. Um, Other than that it's available online, is there an advertising promotional campaign that pushes this information out to maybe segments of our state society that aren't aware that it exists?
Um, well, I mean, we distributed it to our network. We have it on our website, and I know, Aurora has done a lot of promotion of the report, and and of course the other funders that were involved as well have shared it with their networks. So um, Jenny and I did an op-ed that was in the Connecticut Mirror as well. So, we do our best,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah,
really
no, it's
grassroots.
I just, I can't get over how important this is. And I wonder, do you know, are other states doing this? When you were looking for information, did you come across initiatives like this elsewhere? I mean, on a national level, of course, that information is being gathered. But
Mhm.
what about other states gathering it? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, we didn't, when we were putting this together and putting the scope together, it was in the fall of 2020. And at that time, we didn't see much. There are, other women's funds in or foundations in other states. And what they seemed to focus on was the status of women. So looking in the past, but
Mm.
not much looking at the present and what was happening right now, or then during the pandemic. I imagine that over the course of this year, you will see more reports done, but not at the time that we were putting it together.
Because you do see that people are using the term more, she session.
You,
A year ago, that was
yeah,
a vocabulary word any of us would have been
I
familiar
know. I know.
with. So we have another question. How do your data workshops increase data literacy, and why is that an equity issue? And so first, tell us what data literacy is.
Oh, yeah. So that is a key part of what we do at the Connecticut Data Collaborative. It's in our mission is to build data literacy skills. So, um, data literacy is much like reading literacy. It's the familiarity and comfortableness with using numbers, right, and data. So we have different workshops that we hold through what we call our Connecticut Data Academy. So we have data storytelling as a workshop that we hold, intro to public data, data basics, data analysis. We have intro to survey design, all different types of courses to help increase people's data literacy skills, particularly being able to use the data within their organizations to either help tell their story or to help understand the impact of their programs and services. So I, feel, very passionate about this, but, as a woman who, was a math major, but, took me 3 years to decide to be a math major because of, being socialized not to be in math. But, I see in the nonprofit sector, many women running nonprofits, and the workforce is largely female. And yet we are increasingly being need to show the impact of our work. And so that, data is really critical. So, women, as I mentioned, are often not today, but, back years, my generation and older probably, socialized not to like math. So women are scared of numbers and don't, hedge away from it. And I hear so many times, I'm not a data person, but you are, right? You can be. So so.
Well, I like that because, our director of education is on today. Liz, I hope you're hearing this because we recently started an educational program called financial literacy for high school girls. And I like this idea of data literacy as well. And even though it may have been a generational thing, my reading tells me that it still does exist.
Mm,
And it may be just due to the fact that sometimes girls don't raise their hand enough in class. And so we might be disadvantaged in that way. And boys are still sometimes more outgoing and freewheeling in the classroom. But I think math and women is still a territory that needs more attention. So I like this idea of data literacy.
yeah. I do too.
Okay, you
And
do.
I do feel, and people love the workshops. I mean, there's a listing on our website, and many of them all have a small fee, $15, $20, and we only do that because if we're going to hold a workshop, we do want to make sure people come, and it's because we are a nonprofit, staff time is precious.
Well, I just see the hall staff just wrote and said the entire hall staff is signed up for the class.
Oh, excellent. Oh, I look forward to seeing everyone.
That's the beginning, and we can share that with our constituency around the state because you're right. Nonprofits need data to function,
Mhm.
and we are still predominantly, not just in Connecticut, but around the nation, run by women. And
Mhm.
so we mustn't disadvantage ourselves in the fields that we love so much by not being as literate as we can be relative to data. So I thank you for that. I think your passion is one that we can all admire and key into. So
Mhm.
I think, are there any more questions? If not, I think we're going to begin to wind it down. Our time is running out. Michelle, is there anything else more you want to say about the She Session and the data that you've collected? Because this has been very informative and I certainly understand a lot better what we're talking about because so often
Mm,
it's just jobs.
yeah.
A recession, a she session is jobs. And you've
Mhm.
elucidated the many areas that
Mm,
women have been affected by mental health,
mm.
physical health, child care, safety. We didn't even talk about, relationships, marriages, and things that have been affected greatly in the pandemic with all of us living under one roof. So I thank you for that. Well, here's one more. Thank you so much for being here, Michelle. Can you tell me whether you collaborated at all with the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women in their recent survey on the economic impact of COVID on women?
We, at the beginning of our work, we did meet with the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women, and we were hoping to be on parallel tracks. Right, so ours, you asked earlier about ours was focused on public data and theirs was focused on surveying women. Unfortunately, we weren't able to, I think the surveys are hard to collect, right? You really have to, I admire their on the ground work to get survey responses up. So they, recently released theirs, so we weren't able to time our releases, but I do have it on my to-do list to read the report and see how we can look at both in tandem and
Sure.
think about the future, right?
And partner so that all of that data gets to the places that are in most need of it, and those that can institute the programs that we need, that we'll talk about more next week, to address these inequities. I want to thank you so much for coming on board. You make data sexy, and that's that's a good thing, because we want all of us to wrap our heads around it. I'm going to ask you all to please join us for the second segment in this webinar series next week, Thursday, April 29th, when I will have the pleasure of talking to the Aurora Foundation's Executive Director, Dr. Jennifer Stedman, and she will walk us through the recommendations being made to address the findings of this groundbreaking Essentials Equity Report. And please remember, to all of you who joined us today, and to remind others, the health programs are free, funded by individuals, by yourself. So please give what you can at www.cwhf.org. I'm Geena Clonan, thanking Michelle Riordan-Nold for joining us today, and we hope to see you next week as we continue this important conversation. Have a great day.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for participating.
You're welcome. We'll see you all next week.
Bye.